The next subject is, of course, relevant to mergers and acquisitions, and that is the hostile takeover. Now, owing to the nature of a publicly traded business, it is possible to take over a company even though the board of directors doesn't want you to. Of course, that's not possible when you're talking about a private company. When you're talking about a private company, unless the government steps in and requires it for some reason, you can't buy the company unless the owners are willing to sell. But because of the fact that when you're talking about a public company, it's not really owned by the directors are just kind of in charge of it, it is possible to take over a company without the consent of the board of directors, and that is called a hostile takeover. So this occurs when a person or group wants to take over a company without the consent of the board of the target corporation. Now, there will be many different possibilities as to when that might happen. One possibility is the company isn't doing that well. The company has more inherent value, but the stock price is low because of mismanagement. And so other companies look at it and say, if we buy that cheap, if we buy that for not as much money because it's not doing so well, maybe we'll turn it around and we'll be able to buy it for cheap and then make more money. Also, corporations with large stockpiles of cash are attractive takeover targets. Sometimes companies want to invest, but they don't have the money. Now, if they don't have the cash. Now, one thing they could do is they could sell, they could float more shares, they could take out loans, they could issue bonds, but these are all complex and they might not want to. But they also might look around for other companies with cash. A company might be worth $100 billion and see another company worth only $10 billion and say, yeah, but that company with 10 that's worth $10 billion has $2 billion in the bank. So let's go take over that company, and then we'll take that $2 billion and be able to use it towards our infrastructure projects. Whereas we, even though we're worth $100 billion, might not have $2 billion in cash assets. So those are different reasons why there might be a hostile takeover in the first place. Now, in terms of a policy reason to allow hostile takeovers, why doesn't the government just say this is not fair and then we shouldn't allow hostile takeovers? Well, there are a few good reasons. Number one, the threat of a takeover keeps management in line. If the directors know that if they don't do a good job with the company, other companies are going to take them over, and probably once there's a hostile takeover, they're going to get rid of the board of directors and get a new board, and they're going to lose income. That's a good reason for them to try to keep their company competitive. Also, and by the same token, a hostile takeover and a merger causes a little bit more efficiency. Maybe they'll decrease the number of higher management because now there's less to manage. So those are the pros, but that, of course, is the other side of the coin is the managers who are those managers or some managers from may lose their job because if you have two companies and they merge into one, there's a lot of duplication that they might be able to get rid of, so it can lead to layoffs. The battle can be costly in terms of the hostile takeover battle that we'll discuss shortly. It's often executed by greedy corporate raiders who don't care that much about the company's business, but they just want to make a profit. Basically, corporate raiders, people who make money doing this, can buy companies and then turn around and sell the stock for more, especially if they know how to manipulate the market. There were some movies like Wall Street that were, based on corporate raiders, and there were real-life corporate raiders too. And also this idea of green mail. Green mail essentially is when a corporate raider starts to take over a company and buys up some stock and starts the process of a hostile takeover, and then the board of directors is so desperate to get rid of them and keep their jobs that they agree to pay the corporate raider more value than the in order to have the corporate raider go away. Like, for example, if the corporate raider buys $1 million worth of stock and is threatening a hostile takeover, they might pay the corporate raider $2 million just so that the corporate raider will stop. They call that green mail. Nothing inherently illegal about it, but it's just not really the most efficient thing for a company to have to spend its operating money on getting rid of corporate raiders. So, how do you go about doing this? How do you go about enacting a hostile takeover against a company that doesn't want to be taken over? Well, one thing you can do is you can just simply buy the company, buy a controlling block. It could be 51% of the company certainly is a controlling block, but even without 51%, you can buy enough to effectively be able to control the company. Remember, not everybody actually votes in these things, so you don't actually need 51% of the company to control it. You may need 30% or 35%. But the point is, you need a lot. And this makes it not the most efficient way to enact a hostile takeover if the company is a very big company. It takes a lot of money, and also it requires all sorts of sort of SEC filings when you're buying so much stock of a single company, and which means that while you're doing this, the directors will know what's going on, and they may try to stop the hostile takeover. The other two possibilities, number one is a proxy contest. A proxy contest is probably the most common type. And then the proxy contest is where you go directly to the company shareholders. You don't even deal with the board of directors necessarily. You go to the company shareholders and you use your advertising or whatever it is to try to convince them to elect a new board of directors that is friendly to you. And then once the board of directors is friendly to you, once you become the board of directors, then you can pretty much do what you want for the company. It's much less expensive, but also you don't have as much control. It's not like you can just throw cash at it. You have to convince the shareholders to vote for you, and they might or might not do so. You can also do what's called a bear hug. A bear hug is when you just offer so much money, you make them an offer they can't refuse. You offer, if the stock is worth $30 and you offer $50, the offer might be so high that the board of directors might feel under tremendous pressure to accept it, because if they don't accept it, the shareholders may get very upset at them for not, for costing them money by not taking a higher offer. Again, the advantage of that is that it's not as contentious. You don't have to fight SEC filings. You don't have to have a media campaign. But on the other hand, it's the most expensive. You're going to end up paying more than you do if you try a proxy contest or buying up the company yourself. You're going to end up paying more per share. Part of that is what is called a tender offer. A tender offer could be either one. A tender offer is really part of the bear hug strategy of a hostile takeover. It doesn't even have to be hostile. A tender offer is an offer that's made to acquire the target corporation, and you go directly to the shareholders essentially, and this would have to be done through an advertising campaign where you tell the shareholders, okay, we're making this particular offer. And I mean, this is basically the way it works in terms of a diagram. The target corporation is the one that you're trying to take over. So rather than going to their board of directors and asking them to accept or asking them to recommend a merger, instead you just go directly to the shareholders and see if the shareholders will sell you their shares of the company. Now, these are regulated. These are very heavily regulated by the Williams Act of 1968, which is an amendment to the SEC Acts, and it requires certain disclosure requirements. In other words, if you're going to go directly to the shareholders, you need to explain to them certain things about what the consequences of the merger will be, because the fear is obviously that you'll just say, well, you're going to make all this money, and the shareholders don't really fully understand, and don't. If you go to a board of directors, well, the board of directors are professional, and they'll hire people that will do a due diligence and try to make sure that it's a good idea. But on the other hand, the shareholders might not be that sophisticated, and so therefore there are more heavily regulated rules that apply to tender offers than there are when you go directly to the board of directors. And there are some specific rules. There's the fair price rule, which, well, you can probably figure out what that says. A rule that says any increase in price paid for shares must be offered to all shareholders, even if, like for example, if you make a tender offer and then 10% of the shareholders sell to you, and then you make another tender offer and you get another 10%, if you increase the price between the two tender offers, then the first series of recipients, the first series of shareholders that sold out, have to get the same price as the second. The idea is you can't. It wouldn't be fair to pay people just because they're more gullible to get them on the first, because you get them on the first tender offer, so that they should lose out. There's also the pro rata rule, which says that shares must be purchased on a pro rata basis if they're tendered. You can't buy just from some shareholders. If a person owns 1,000 shares and another person owns 10,000 shares, you have to buy them proportionally. You can't a tender offer which goes, again, you're not talking about buying individual shareholders. That you can do without a tender offer. That has nothing to do with it. A tender offer is something that's open to all shareholders of a company, so it has to be proportional. It has to be fair. And there are also anti-fraud provisions that are relevant to tender offers. It prohibits fraudulent, deceptive, and manipulative practices, and of course violations. And it's beyond the scope of the course to go through the specifics of those kinds of rules, but the point is there's very heavy regulation with regard to tender offers and with regard to dealing directly with shareholders when you're talking about trying to take over a corporation. Now, what can a board of directors that realizes or thinks it's about to be subject to a hostile takeover attempt do? Again, we're talking about a bear hug, we're talking about a proxy contest, we're talking about a tender offer, we're talking about the company trying to buy up shares. These are all different methods of a hostile takeover. And so, what can the management of the board of directors of the target company do to try to prevent this? Because again, you have to realize if once there is a merger, they're probably going to lose their jobs, and even if they don't, it won't be their company anymore. So one thing they can do is they can propose a plan of their own. If it's a tender offer or if it's a proxy contest, they can explain to the shareholders why the shareholders are better off leaving them in charge. We're going to turn around the company doing XYZ. They can also try to find a white knight, which is an alternative buyer. If they're worried about the corporate raider or the purchaser being somebody that's bad for the company, well, they can try to find somebody else to step in that's more friendly to this board of directors and buy the company instead. That's a simple alternative to being taken over. Instead of being taken over by somebody that's hostile, you try to get somebody who's less hostile to take over to buy your company in the first place. You can also stagger the board, which many companies do. Instead of having let's say there are 9 directors, instead of having them all 9 elected every year, say have 3 of them elected every year, so that it's harder to, let's say, for example, get a proxy contest when you have to convince shareholders to vote for you in 3 different elections. It's much harder to do that, obviously, than it is to do it all in one direction, in one election. One other thing you can do is you can adopt what is called a poison pill. A poison pill is kind of a strange mechanism. There's no law about a poison pill. Some smart director thought of it at one point, and what a poison pill essentially says, as the name indicates, is that if you take over the company is going to be worthless. And the way it does this is it says something like this. It says, if we get taken over, then every shareholder has the right to buy shares at 1 cent each. Can buy, 1 million shares at 1 cent each. Now, if that actually comes to fruition, and the provision actually goes into effect, well, then the company's going to get destroyed because now the company's shares are going to be worth 1 cent. If the company shares were worth $80, but there's a provision saying that if they get taken over, now all of a sudden they can buy shares from the company worth for 1 cent, well, then the market value of those shares becomes 1 cent, and once the market value of the shares is worth 1 cent, the whole thing becomes a joke, and the company will fall apart. So the idea of that is to try to make sure that people don't is that you make sure that the corporate raider or whoever is trying to enact the hostile takeover doesn't actually commit the takeover, doesn't actually do the takeover, because if they do, they're going to be destroying the company that they purchased. Very often this is done as leverage. You don't want to do it. You don't want to be stuck with a poison. You don't want to. If you're worried that somebody's going to take over your company, you don't simply always want to resort to this tactic, because then the shareholders will know that you're incompetent and you have to resort to these kinds of tactics in order to prevent a takeover, and you don't want to do a good job managing the company. So they'll probably vote you out of office, and people won't invest in you if they think that you lack self-confidence to the extent that you have to do a poison pill. So instead, very often this will be kind of a negotiating tactic. The company will adopt a poison pill, a provision that says that if we get taken over, all these rights provisions kick in that are going to destroy the company. But they can negotiate with the company trying to do a hostile takeover, and if they come to an agreement, well, they can always rescind it, just like a board of directors can adopt one of these shareholder rights provisions that essentially is a poison pill. It can also cancel it. One time, the dead hand poison pill, which courts have not allowed, is when a board of directors tried to enact a poison pill that only they could undo. And the court said that's too much of a restriction. So again, it's a little beyond the scope of the course to go through in detail, but the poison pill is a strategy by which you try to prevent a hostile takeover by causing the takeover to trigger a shareholder rights provision that would make the company worthless if it actually establishes. And here are some other examples in terms of fighting a tender offer or fighting a hostile takeover. I think some of this, so you can try to persuade the shareholders that you're right. You can file lawsuits you can try to find ways to file lawsuits and tie the thing up in court. You can sell a crown jewel, in other words, sell a good part of the company to make the company less valuable, to make the person trying the hostile takeover take pause. You can adopt a poison pill, as we discussed. You can find a white knight. You can do a reverse tender offer, where you try to buy the remaining shares from the shareholders yourself, rather than letting the corporate raider do it. You can issue additional stock. You can create an employee stock ownership plan, and various other things. You can pay off the hostile takeover wannabe. And these are some of the things that we've discussed in terms of how you can fight a hostile takeover attempt.